Welcome to Novara Live, coming up tonight. We never thought we'd see this day arrive. The man formerly known as Prince Andrew has been arrested over his links to Jeffrey Epstein. Reform have said they'll tear up the Equalities Act, and their top performers are flailing under media pressure. And one of the most bizarre interviews I've ever seen, LBC's Iain Dale introduces Zack Polanski to special guest star Vladimir Putin. I'm Helena, you'll know me as No Justice MTG, but today, for one day only, I will be Some Justice MTG. And I'm joined tonight by Dalia Gebrial. Dalia, how are we?
I'm good. I mean, what a way to kick off Pisces season. We're going to talk about this once in a 500-year political event, which is someone in line for the throne being arrested. Which is, I'm glad to be discussing it with you at least.
Today is Thursday, which means it's your weekly reminder to sign up to Novara's top newsletter, The Cortado. Every Friday and Monday morning, Ash and Stephen deliver their take on the top news stories directly to your inbox. Once again, there's been some big stories. Who better to break them down with other than Ash tomorrow morning? Sign up at novara.media/The Cortado to receive tomorrow's edition. In news that's almost impossible to believe, the man formerly known as Prince Andrew has been arrested by Thames Valley Police. Now, I say it's almost impossible to believe, not because I believe the arrest is wrong, but because nothing like it has happened to him in a very, very long time. And we almost never see those with immense wealth, power, and protection even so much as brush up against justice. Police officers were seen outside Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's home on King Charles's Sandringham estate this morning, where Andrew was arrested under suspicion of misconduct in public office by officers involved in investigating his connections to dead billionaire sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Police were also seen at Andrew's former home Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, with multiple vans arriving at the mansion earlier this afternoon to undertake a search of the property. His brother, the King, appears to have been given the impression of business as usual, with Charles arriving at a London Fashion Week event this afternoon. But don't let that impression fool you. The arrest of Prince Andrew is the first time a royal has been taken into custody in more than 350 years. And it's the first time the sibling of a monarch since 1554, when the future Queen Elizabeth I was detained over suspicions of her involvement in a plot to overthrow her sister, Queen Mary I. This is very much uncharted territory, and it has all the marks of a potential constitutional crisis. In a statement responding to his brother's arrest, the King said this: "I have learnt with the deepest concern the news about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and suspicion of misconduct in public office. What now follows is the full, fair and proper process by which this issue is investigated in the appropriate manner and by the appropriate authorities. In this, as I have said before, they have our full and wholehearted support and cooperation. Let me state clearly, the law must take its course. As this process continues, it would not be right for me to comment further on this matter." Thames Valley Police have also released a statement that says this: "As part of the investigation, we have today arrested a man in his 60s from Norfolk on suspicion of misconduct in public office and are carrying out searches at addresses in Berkshire and Norfolk. The man remains in police custody at this time. We will not be naming the arrested man as per national guidance. Please also remember that this case is now active, so care should be taken with any publication to avoid being in contempt of court." Dalia, before we get into the details, what's your first impression on hearing this news this morning?
I mean, when I first saw the news, I thought, wow, I mean, that is somewhat unprecedented. And that was before I knew all of the kind of more detailed historical context that you outlined of exactly how unusual it is for a member of the royal family, a senior member of the royal family, to face criminal justice of some form. But at the same time, I mean, Virginia Giuffre first made her accusation in 2014. We had the Emily Maitlis interview 6 years ago. So it's been a long time that it's been quite a while that we have had this sense that there's a wrongdoing there, possibly criminal acts that have been done. And we've been sort of waiting for both something and nothing to happen. Like we've both been thinking, okay, well, is anything going to happen? And then also believing, well, of course, nothing could happen because it's the king's brother and nothing happens to the king's brother. And it also is important to note that what is it that he has actually been arrested for? He's not been arrested for allegedly having inappropriate sexual relations with a minor. He's not being arrested for the litany of stories that we have heard from people who have worked in Buckingham Palace, people who have left Buckingham Palace, who say that this was a nasty and abusive, horrible man. He is being arrested because he undermined people in power. And I don't mean that in a way to kind of give him any sort of credence or suggest that there's anything honorable about this. He undermined people in power by sharing trade secrets and sharing classified information with other powerful people. So as much as it feels like finally someone is being held accountable, it's important to remember, he also has not actually been made to go and testify in the US, despite the fact that that could bring people who have trafficked young girls to other powerful people, that could bring them to justice. So what that tells me is that the thing that actually got him, the thing that he actually faced a consequence for, is not the stuff that has been, shocking regular people for several years now, not for the alleged abuse, not for the alleged helping to cover up the abuse, both for Virginia Giuffre allegedly, and also of workers in Buckingham Palace, but because he undermined people in power by sharing secrets with people that they didn't want to see, not in any kind of honourable sense. But what that tells me is that all those other things that he has been accused of, the abusive behaviour, allegedly, that Andrew has been accused of, that is actually fairly acceptable. That is still not something that a member of the royal family, that someone in power will face accountability for. And so as much as it was quite, it felt like, oh, finally, someone is being held to account. When you actually sit back and think about it, he's not being held accountable for some of the things that have been on a moral level the most shocking, which is his abuse of power when it impacts people who are more vulnerable than him. It's only happened when it's been an abuse of his power in a way that has had consequences for other powerful people.
So I guess we probably better look at the things that he has been arrested for. Well, as I said, it's on suspicion of misconduct in public office. If charged and found guilty, that's a crime that carries a sentence of up to life in prison. We don't, however, know exactly what's led to today's arrest. But according to reporting, it's thought to pertain to allegations that Andrew may have fed Jeffrey Epstein privileged information while employed as a trade envoy for the UK government. In this November 2010 email, the then Duke's assistant sends Andrew confidential visit reports from a recent tour of East Asia. 5 minutes later, and Andrew appears to forward them on to Epstein. The emails show Andrew may have sent Epstein similarly confidential briefings from before that trade visit. Documents also appear to show that Andrew forwarded Epstein information on investment opportunities in gold and uranium in Afghanistan. Now, it is important to say that Andrew has so far not been charged with any crime, and that he has also strongly denied any wrongdoing. But there are indications from the Epstein files that Andrew may not always be entirely reliable on these matters. This is from Emily Maitlis' excruciating interview with Andrew in 2019.
He was released in July. Within months, by December of 2010, you went to stay with him at his New York mansion. Why? Why were you staying with a convicted sex offender?
Right. I have always, ever since this has happened, and since this has become, as it were, public knowledge that I was there, I've questioned myself as to why did I go, what was I doing, and was it the right thing to do? Now, I went there with the sole purpose of saying to him that because he had been convicted, it was inappropriate for us to be seen together. And I had a number of people counsel me in both directions, either to go and see him or not to go and see him. And I took the judgment call that because this was serious, and I felt that doing it over the telephone was the chicken's way of doing it. I had to go and see him and talk to him. And I went to see him, and I was doing a number of other things in New York at the time, and we had an opportunity to go for a walk in the park, and that was the conversation, coincidentally, that was photographed, which was when I said to him, I said, look, because of what has happened, I don't think it is appropriate that we should remain in contact.
Epstein was released from house arrest in July 2010, so Andrew is talking about ending the friendship in December 2010. Well, Andrew appears to have forwarded those documents about his Asian trip to Epstein in December 2010. Maybe that was still before he'd broken up with the paedophile. Except it also looks like the two were in touch in 2011. In February of that year, the Mail on Sunday was planning on running a story on Andrew, apparently alleging sexual impropriety. They dropped that part of the story after a lengthy discussion with Andrew's aides. But this is the relevant part. After getting that update from the Deputy Press Secretary to the Queen, Andrew appears to have forwarded all the information to Epstein, saying, latest. That's at least 2 months after Andrew says he ended communications with Epstein. But their correspondence also appears to have been happening immediately after Epstein was freed from house arrest on child sex charges in July 2010. Here's another bit from that Mateless interview.
In 2008, he was convicted of soliciting and procuring a minor for prostitution. He was jailed. This was your friend. How did you feel about it?
Well, I ceased contact with him after I was aware that he was under investigation, and that was later on in 2006. And I wasn't in touch with him again until 2010. So it was one of those things that if somebody's going through that sort of thing, well, I'm terribly sorry, I can't be.
So no contact?
No contact.
When he was serving time, there was no call, no letter, nothing there?
No.
It wasn't long after that release that Epstein and Andrew appear to have picked up their chats. This is from August in 2010. Epstein writes to Andrew, I have a friend who I think you might enjoy having dinner with. Her name is redacted. She will be in London from the 20th until the 24th. Andrew replies, of course, will you be bringing a message from you? And he asks that Epstein pass on his contact details. Andrew appears to ask Epstein for more information on the young woman, as well as wanting to know what Epstein has said about him. Epstein is curt. She's 26, clever, beautiful and trustworthy, and has Andrew's email. To which Andrew replies, that was quick. How are you? Good to be free? That certainly appears to be an inquiry into whether Epstein is enjoying no longer being under house arrest on child sex offences. As I say, we don't know exactly what the police are looking into. But as previously, police have also said they were investigating Andrew in relation to sex trafficking in 2010. Earlier this month, police said they were assessing a second allegation that Epstein had supplied a woman to Andrew for sex, the first, of course, being Virginia Giuffre, who claimed that Epstein trafficked her to Andrew when she was just 17. This was from the BBC at the beginning of February. The encounter allegedly occurred in the former prince's residence, Royal Lodge, in 2010. The woman, who is not British, was in her 20s at the time. Her lawyer, Brad Edwards, has previously told BBC News, we're talking about at least one woman who was sent by Jeffrey Epstein over to Prince Andrew. Edwards, whose US law firm has been representing Epstein victims since 2008, said that after spending the night with Mountbatten Windsor, the woman says she was given a tea and a tour of Buckingham Palace. The palace routinely records the names of tour guests, but it has not been possible for the BBC to corroborate the woman's visit without revealing her identity. Now, it's this kind of thing that's leading some people to wonder whether there is an even bigger problem at Buckingham Palace. This was Graham Smith of anti-monarchy organisation Republic on the BBC earlier today.
This is a very, very serious crisis, the worst serious crisis that has hit the monarchy in living memory in the democratic era. And, you know, we have an institution that is already losing support quite rapidly. We have an institution that most people under the age of 50 are not that bothered about. And now they are exposed to quite serious accusations. It's not just Andrew. There are serious questions being asked, as we heard, hecklers asking them. BBC journalists, not so much, but hecklers are asking these serious questions about what did William and Charles know? When did they know it? And, it's not serious to suggest that Andrew, if these allegations are true, has been behaving like this over the last 25, 30 years and no one else knew. So there are much more serious questions which are not going to go away about how far the rot goes in the monarchy.
Well, there's absolutely no evidence of any prior knowledge of the King nor Prince William. What there is evidence of, though, is what we've been seeing, and that is that at least to some degree, the King has allowed the law to take its course. And surely that is all a head of state can do.
This is a very nice pro-royal BBC line in there. Let's push the palace line, because there is evidence that the royals knew. Andrew Lowney has made that abundantly clear that there is evidence the royals knew. So I don't know why he said that.
How does Andrew Lowney know? What's his evidence? Where does he get his information from?
You'll have to talk to Andrew Lowney about that. But just to simply dismiss it out of hand is just simply not acceptable. Now
I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying there's no evidence for what you're saying.
Well, that's not true. So, but apart from anything else, it is not serious. And any serious journalist would know this, that you cannot believe that Andrew, surrounded by police, by civil servants, by government ministers, by other royals, for 30 years, 40 years he's known Epstein, that no one knew anything about anything that he was up to. That is not a serious thing. And journalists like yourself should be going to Charles. They should be the ones standing at the fence line saying to Charles, what did you know when, and getting those answers. Because until we get those answers, we can't say whether or not they knew. So those questions need to be asked.
Now, Dalia, we can't go into too much speculation about the Andrew case, but do you agree with Smith that there's probably a much bigger institutional problem here?
Yeah, and I mean, it's an institutional problem that is somewhat unavoidable. I mean, I do find the shock and horror of pro-monarchists or people who are otherwise very unquestioning about the importance of a monarchy in Britain seeming to be very shocked and in awe that this kind of corruption exists within this kind of power, because you and we've sort of not had to confront this contradiction or this problem under Queen Elizabeth, because she was very good at sort of keeping a lid on these things, in some cases through literally helping to pay off survivors so that things don't escalate further, as we saw in the case of Virginia Giuffre, and in other cases through genuinely projecting a sort of symbolic value that I think a lot of people in this country really appreciated. But what I think we have to really reckon with now is that this idea that somehow we reached this happy balance with the monarchy, where we have this monarchy that has just purely symbolic power, and so the fact that this is a hereditary form of power, i.e. you are born into it, and therefore it is not questionable or accountable power, and it's a form of power that there's very few levers of accountability against, as we know by the fact that they have by default almost immunity from the criminal justice system, this being a huge exception to that you can't sort of have that. So there was an idea that it's okay that there's that level of shielding from any kind of accountability because they don't have any real power. And I think we can see that is not true. Yes, the power is soft power, but soft power is still power. And we can see that by the fact that Andrew had access to documents and pieces of information that he could hand over to someone like Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein would not have invested so much effort and resources into keeping someone like Andrew close if Andrew did not have some form of power by virtue of being in the monarchy. So we need to get very real here, that by continuing to have a monarchy in this way, we are giving people, a group of people, hereditary, broadly unquestioned, real, even if it's soft, real power. And so I don't know how you can be surprised that if you have people who have unaccountable forms of actual power, that there's not going to be some point at which that power, at which we see corruption, or at which we see abuse of that power, because that's inevitable when you have unaccountable power. So I think what we can see from both Epstein's relationship with Andrew and the fact that he found Andrew's relationship to be hugely advantageous to him, and the fact that by virtue of his position, Andrew was able to hand over sensitive and important information to someone like Jeffrey Epstein, we need to get very honest about the fact that this is not just, that the monarchy is not just representative, it's not just symbolic, but it is an institution that has real power, and there are significant risks that come with people having power that is hereditary and broadly unquestioned.
And I think that's reflected in the fact that it's not just our royal family that's been implicated in the Epstein files. There have been royals and monarchs from other countries as well, like multiple other countries that have been implicated, or at the very least had people with questions to answer for their links with Jeffrey Epstein. So as it shows that actually it is a case of the power of the institution itself, of monarchy in its essence, rather than some specific issue with the British monarchy overall, right? It is having that unchecked power in the first place that is the common denominator between a lot of the people implicated in Epstein, people with wealth and power who for a long time have been shielded and are now facing consequence in the light of the release of the information. As everyone knows, Andrew was the Queen's favourite son. That led some commentators to say how happy they are that she's not around to see her little prince brought so low. This was James O'Brien on LBC.
Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, as he currently calls himself, the former Duke of York, the former Prince Andrew, is under arrest. He was arrested this morning at his new home in Norfolk, or at least where he's currently staying, on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. And he is under arrest on suspicion of misconduct in public office. I hope this doesn't sound inappropriate. I mean, I'm glad that the late Queen isn't alive to see this, actually, because it is a moment of, I'm going to use the word, and I'm going to stop making jokes about using the word because it's the only word that fits. It's a moment of unprecedented jeopardy.
And here was Conservative Home's Tim Montgomery. I'm just glad the Queen didn't see this day. It would have broken her heart. I mean, to be fair, given how much money was spent in settling out of court, maybe, just my opinion here, Tim, maybe it's my opinion that she kind of had seen all of the things potentially that would have made her very upset. And quite frankly, I don't think it's necessarily the reputation of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha that is, in, as far as I can see, something that she was concerned with here, especially when that money was happy to be stumped up in the first place. Dalia, what's your reaction to their comments?
Look, I know that Andrew hasn't been arrested for the allegations of sexual abuse and sexual assault, but I think it shows an astounding lack of empathy to, at this moment, when he is finally facing some kind of modicum of accountability for networks that he was clearly implicated in through his strong friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, whether or not there was actually abuse that took place by Andrew, of course, is an allegation, but it shows an astounding lack of empathy that we are talking about a situation in which there are hundreds of now adult women who were young girls when they were abused under within Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking network, which one of those women, Virginia Giuffre, who is now dead, has implicated Andrew in. It is astounding to reserve your sorrow and compassion for the Queen, who, as you mentioned, Helena, did help Andrew get away with some of this. You know, she notoriously was stumped up a lot of money, and because he was her favorite, did try and shield him from the consequences, both because it's her son and also to protect the broader institution. And this is the kind of dirty work that you have to engage in to protect an institution that is prone to corruption, because it endows a random group of people with unchecked hereditary power. But for Tim Montgomery and specifically, I want to just make a slight point here. Tim Montgomery is a reform supporter. You know, he's gone from the Conservatives to reform. And I think, we need to think really critically about why outriders and members of the law and order party, the party that their headline is basically lock them up if they're, an undocumented migrant, if they've sought asylum in this country, if they've snatched a phone, if you've done any kind of what they view as transgression, you need to be locked up, throw away the key. They call it zero tolerance policing. They want to introduce stop and search, reintroduce and redeploy stop and search in what they call crime hotspot areas, basically working class Black and brown neighborhoods. They want to build 10,000 new prison places that they also want to fill likely with Black and brown working class people. For those people, they have zero tolerance. They say it in their own terms, zero tolerance policing for working class people. But when it comes to their wealthy mates, billionaires, royals, millionaires, it's nothing but compassion and understanding, apparently.
The arrest of Andrew is also, understandably, having an impact on investigations into Epstein taking place in the United States. Democrat member of the House Oversight Committee, Suhas Subramaniam, said this today. He appears repeatedly in the documents we have uncovered as having knowledge of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes, and is specifically named by victims as someone who engaged in wrongdoing. Yet he has continued to ignore our calls to cooperate with the Oversight Committee's investigation. We hope today's arrest will lead to answers and show that there will be accountability, even if you hide, regardless of how rich and powerful you are. That's not really true, though, is it? So far, just 2 people have faced arrest over their alleged connections to Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's crimes revealed in the Epstein files. They are former Norwegian Prime Minister Torbjørn Jagland and now Andrew. Former British Ambassador to the US Peter Mandelson has not been arrested, though remains under police investigation. He denies all allegations of wrongdoing. And none of those men are in the USA. Dalia. Blood royals, potentially facing some consequences, but the elected head of state of the United States, potentially, who's named in potentially millions of times in the Epstein files, doesn't apparently have any questions to answer.
Well, this is where the soft and hard power distinction comes in. Why is it that the only people that are facing accountability, other than, of course, Ghislaine Maxwell, who is currently serving a prison sentence, are the royals? And it's because when you have nothing but symbolic power, when that symbolic power dissipates, you become useless. And in a sense, not to bring out a tiny violin for these men, but they are sort of sacrificial lambs because they don't actually have concrete power. They don't actually have money in the way that a lot of the people that Jeffrey Epstein was networked with, that their money is not as doesn't go as far as a lot of these other men, because they don't have these kind of political or corporate forms of power. The power is cultural, it is symbolic, which goes a very long way. But it's very easily lost because it's reputation. It's kind of reputational, and it just goes to show as well that the only kinds of consequences that people are facing here is reputational. It's a PR risk for all of the people who have been implicated in these files, in these emails. The risk they have faced is primarily reputational and PR. It hasn't actually been to their money, and it hasn't actually been a criminal justice issue. It's not been an issue where, like for anyone else who breaks the law this flagrantly, their freedom is at stake. But for a lot of these men, their freedom isn't at stake, their money isn't at stake. What's at stake is their reputation. And that's why a lot of them are staying quiet, because when you have a PR crisis, you just kind of sit, grin your teeth, bear it, let the storm pass. And that's the calculation that many of them are making. So to an extent, I think these royals have been kind of offered up a little bit of as sacrificial lambs. Doesn't mean I'm not going to take it, because at least someone has faced something. But that might explain the reason why these 2 men in particular have been sort of discarded, whereas other men who have concrete power, more concrete forms of power, have continued to get away with it. And I do think as well that point about these men not being forced to testify, even though, Andrew has apologized, said that he has compassion for these victims. He sort of tried to, and even Charles has said, we have compassion for the victims. But the only way you can express true compassion and true solidarity with those victims, if that was a sincerely held perspective, then they would go and testify on behalf of those girls in that case in order to bring their perpetrators to justice. Because as much as Andrew likes to protest otherwise, it is very clear that he knew a lot more than what he claims he knew when it comes to what was going on. And so his testimony would be incredibly valuable. And until that testimony is given, it doesn't matter how much any of these people apologize, we know that it's not a sincerely held remorse over their relationship to Epstein, because that has got to translate into solidarity with these victims, which involves going in front of Congress and telling them everything that you know.
Now, if there's one thing a Conservative loves, it's hierarchy, and Reform UK are no different. One particular bugbear for the hard right in the UK, from the constitutional reforms of the New Labour era, is the Equalities Act, a groundbreaking piece of legislation that has created the framework to at least try and make our society more meritocratic. On Tuesday, Reform's Equality spokesperson Suella Braverman confirmed that they would repeal that act, and they sent Robert Jenrick onto the BBC this morning to defend that policy.
We, of course, want to see the protections that have been put in place over the years maintained, like the Equal Pay Act, that ensured that women received the same pay as men in the workplace, or the Race Equality Act, or the Disability Discrimination Act, pieces of legislation that made our country a fairer place. What we disagree with, as millions of people do across the country, was the very harmful piece of legislation that was put in place, again by a dying government, by Gordon Brown and Harriet Harman at the end of that parliament just before the 2010 general election, which has created perverse situations in this country where, say, a white working class boy from the town that I represent, Newark in North Nottinghamshire, couldn't apply for an internship at GCHQ or the Foreign Office or the Bank of England because they had decided to do an internship scheme that was only applicable to people with a certain skin colour and could hide behind this piece of law to defend their actions. We believe in equality before the law, where everyone in this country is born equal, and that we build a society where everyone can get the same opportunities. They need legal protections at times to ensure that happens, but we don't want to create perverse situations where different groups, faiths and skin colours get different treatment to others. That's wrong, that isn't British, and Reform is going to change that.
Charlie State then quizzed Jenrick on his own experiences, and it led to an absurd assertion by Robert Jenrick.
Do you think you, as an individual, have ever been subject to discrimination?
Not especially. I mean, look, I've seen discrimination in my life. I grew up in Wolverhampton in the 1980s and 90s, where I witnessed racism amongst friends and neighbours that I had. I have Jewish children today with my wife and have been subject, or seen them and my wife subject to anti-Semitism. So I do have some understanding of what some sections of our society face, and that is one of the things that drives me in politics.
And I
want a fairer society where
Mr.
people
Jenrick,
can all have access to opportunities irrespective of their gender, their faith, or their skin colour.
The reason I asked that question
if I may just finish the point, the problem with the legislation as it is today, why Reform wants to change it, is it is creating mad, perverse situations where some groups, for example, white working class boys, who we know the evidence suggests are actually performing amongst the worst in our education system today, are actually positively discriminated against, and that is protected under this law. So we want to rebalance the playing field, and the principle that we're going to ensure is, as I say, equality before the law.
The reason I asked you that question about, whether you yourself have been subject to discrimination is those people who have benefited over the years from the 2010 Equality Act, which you wish to get rid of, might well say, well, if it hadn't been there, unfair things would have happened to me. That necessarily is true because they used those laws to protect themselves.
I don't think that's right. Look,
so there would be no one who's benefited from those laws?
I don't think on balance that's correct, no.
So he's just talking bollocks here, by the way. The Equality Act added necessary protections that were not included in the previous legislation that Jenrick is referencing. And you'll not be in any way surprised to find out that a lot of it is around employment law. I can't believe a party funded by multimillionaires would look into that. This includes outlawing pay secrecy clauses so that workers can freely discuss pay to ensure full transparency from their employer, and outlawing pre-employment health checks to prevent employers from filtering out the disabled. And he's also wrong about the positive action provisions. No one is forced to use them, and the Act specifically carves out that they cannot be used to automatically favour any group or to promote a candidate of a specific demographic over a more qualified candidate. That is positive discrimination, which is illegal, by the way. The anti-DEI push by the right is yet more yank slop imported by MPs who either spend too much time on Twitter or too much time reading Heritage Foundation press releases and think that kind of positive discrimination that happens in the United States is what is happening over here, where again, it is already outlawed. Now, whilst Robert Jenrick is a seasoned media performer, the same can't really be said of Zia Yusuf, Reform's Home Affairs spokesperson, who did not get as easy a time as Jenrick when he was pressed on this issue by Victoria Derbyshire.
Which do you not want to protect? Is it sex?
Well, hold on.
I'm going to go through the list. Will you protect sex?
But you've got to look at how all of these things work together. With respect, you can't reduce a serious conversation like this to 2 minutes.
Forgive me. I am not reducing anything. I am literally going to go through the protected characteristics and ask what a reform government. Okay, whether the reform government would protect them in the future or not. The fundamental problem with the line of questioning here is that you're not going to ask me about the fundamental point that I'm making, which is that, for example, social class is not listed or mentioned in that at all. I'll ask you in a moment. Are you going to protect sex?
We believe that regardless of your biological sex, you should have an equal right to a job.
Okay. Are you going to protect...
Now, whether that...
Okay. Sorry, we've got a list here.
Okay, fine. Go ahead.
Are you going to protect sexual orientation?
Yes, those things.
Disability?
Again, but we've got to be clear about what we mean when we say protect, right? Because the way the Act is drafted, again, there are a lot of things that are positive duties that are placed on people like employers, for example. There are laws in other statutes, by the way, that protect people from discrimination. But we've also got to be clear that the way the Act ends up functioning is as a result of all of these things being put together. So if you're going to try and create an exhaustive list...
It consolidated a lot of legislation.
Yeah.
Disability.
We've already covered that, yes.
Race.
Yes, we would
religion.
Protect that. Hold on. So I want to make the point again. If we go through every type of...
there aren't many left.
If we go through every type of discrimination you would want to get to, again, we end up with, you've got to read the Act in full because of... So, for example, if the Act actually legislated against discriminating based on biological sex, for example, then a lot of the outcomes, the negative outcomes for white working class boys in particular, would not be happening. Okay. Where the devil is in the detail, where it starts talking about positive action. And, you know, we've seen examples of this. It was our own His Majesty's Royal Air Force some years ago, ended up losing a tribunal because that was a real obvious, frankly, open and shut case where they were routinely discriminating against men, for example, for those positions.
Hang on a minute. So if the statutes that already exist found that the RAF were discriminating against men, then you're admitting the legal framework as it currently is works to protect them as intended. It protects men and boys from discrimination. And second of all, class was addressed in the Equality Act until it was removed by the Conservative Party, of which 80% of Reform's cosplay shadow cabinet used to be members of. This socio-economic duty clause removed by Theresa May would have required public bodies to ensure they were addressing class inequality and to try and improve outcomes in the deprived areas that Zia Yusuf seemingly cares so much about. It's those same areas where we see huge amounts of social deprivation affecting working class people now after 14 years of Tory austerity. The kind of austerity that both Reform and the Tories say we should do even more of. Now, class is not treated as a protected characteristic, as it's much harder to define and it's not innate, as the others are. But the protections removed by Theresa May should absolutely be put back. Luckily for Newsnight viewers, former Green Party MP Caroline Lucas was on hand to give Yusuf a richly deserved dressing down.
I want to say that your position is utterly incoherent. You have cited no evidence that suggests that it's the Equalities Act that is responsible for discrimination against white working class boys. And when it comes to the wider issue of taking your word on anything that you've said, it seems to be a really muddled message that when you say something about Robert Jenrick a few years ago and you don't really know him, we're not to take it seriously, whereas now we are to take you seriously. I mean, why would you put something out in the public domain in a very public way that was not in any way, ambiguous? It was a very strong message against Robert Jenrick, and now suddenly we're to believe it. We've got Suella Braverman ripping up the Equalities Act. We've got Richard Tice suggesting now that people are going to end up with far more expensive energy bills, quite frankly, because he wants to go drilling more in the North Sea rather than using renewable energy. We've got a party that pretends to be an insurgent party, an anti-establishment, anti-elite party, and yet it's stuffed full of old Tory retreads. I mean, it just doesn't add up. And I think people looking at this press conference this afternoon are just going to feel this party just doesn't know what it's doing. The interesting thing, of course, was that Nigel Farage was trying to present the other spokespeople as a way of saying, it's no longer just about me, it's about all of us. 25 questions he was asked by the press, rather all of you were asked by the press, and Nigel Farage answered all of them.
Well, given Yusuf's performance there, I'm not surprised that up to this point, Farage has kept it the one-man band that it has been so far. Dalia. Now, of course, these media performances are quite funny to watch, but the point they're making is very serious, and the things that they will do and the externalities of those policies are very dangerous. What's your take on them deciding that they want to get rid of the Equality Act?
I mean, it is nothing to do with, I think that the using of white working class boys as somehow the victims of, or having been victimized by the Equalities Act is a really manipulative sleight of hand. Because what you actually have here is conditions for white working class boys, as is the case for all of the working class, have been deteriorating. They've been deteriorating significantly since austerity, but they've been deteriorating, I would argue, for a while now, since the 70s. The reasons for that is because we have removed regulation that protects workers' rights in this country. We have weakened the labour movement. We have slashed the welfare state, meaning that if you are unable, if your employer doesn't pay you enough to live a decent life, you can't find support from the state to help plug that gap. Housing is out of control. The cost of living is out of control. These are structural class war issues that white working class boys, like all other members of the working class, have been negatively affected by. But when they associate that decline with the introduction of the 2010 Equalities Act, what they are trying to say there is that the reason that the conditions of working class boys have declined in recent years is because Black and brown people have taken their place, which they do not deserve. I have personal experience of this. In every educational institution I have been in, I now work at a university. I've been through the education system. I've been in various kinds of employment. And any time I've been in a form of employment or education that has been considered high achieving or exclusive in some way, without fail, every single time, someone has made an implication, directly or indirectly, that the only reason I got in is because of my race or gender. And the thing that I always like to say back to them is well, if the reason I got in here is because of my race and gender, then why am I the only woman of colour in this room? Clearly, I'm not unfairly taking the place of someone else. It's that actually this entire space is socially and culturally and on a class level skewed towards a certain demographic. And I have got here, in whether it is through an inclusion program or not, even though I haven't actually gotten through on any explicit inclusion programs. But even if that is the case, it's because this entire context is skewed against me to begin with. But it is a classic sleight of hand by conflating the decline in conditions for white working class people, which is a structural problem, which is a consequence of the very kinds of politics that Nigel Farage and his neoliberal cadre have supported in this country for decades now, including the now washed up Tories that now populate Reform's shadow cabinet. the attributing of that decline to the unfair entrance of Black and brown people into various parts of the labour market. You know, Jenrick used that example of saying white working class boys in this country can't get onto internships because these internships are exclusively for Black and brown people, for people of colour or racially minoritized people. No, I mean, there has been a complete collapse in youth employment. There has been a complete collapse in the availability of internships that are actually accessible for working class people. There has been a complete collapse in wages. There's been a complete collapse in graduate jobs. That's not because a couple of industries have had internships for underrepresented minorities. But it's a way of converting this class-based structural problem, which reformist politics are invested in furthering, and in fact just trying to turn different parts of the working class against one another. But that is exactly the kind of effect that he is trying to achieve.
And it's really worth just reiterating this. Positive discrimination is not legal in this country. You cannot deliberately hire people who are of lower merit just because of their demographic characteristics over somebody with higher merit. You cannot do that. That is illegal. And it's the Equalities Act that has allowed there to be a provision to be able to choose somebody from an underrepresented minority if they are underrepresented as to achieve the aim of getting them more equal representation in that area. You cannot use it for positive discrimination. All the claims that is happening are just totally untrue. And you'd only think that if their entire politics was seen through the prism of the American DEI system, which is in no way similar to the EDI one that we have in this country. And if you really want to look at the problems facing working class communities in this country, austerity is obviously patient zero. And not only did Robert Jenrick praise George Osborne and David Cameron in his video that he did when he was trying to become the Conservative Party leader, he did a speech as Reform's shadow chancellor. He's just a spokesperson on economic issues in reality, where he was echoing all the same kind of sentiments about the economy that George Osborne was saying in the 2010s when they were slashing access to programs for people from underrepresented backgrounds, right? For example, you look at the music industry nowadays, where the bands that you see are all from pretty privileged upbringings because people who come from poorer backgrounds, they can't afford instruments, they can't afford rehearsal space, they don't get adequate provision for learning music at school because these are poorer areas with lower budgets. And that's a deliberate result of the cuts to those schemes from the Osborne administration. Cuts that the Reform UK cabinet have no intention of reversing. Now, it's not just your equality protections at work that Reform are coming for. They're also coming for your wages. Their business and trade spokesperson Richard Tice has said that the party would consider looking at a reduction in the UK's minimum wage for young people, responding to questions around high levels of youth unemployment. And Reform's rhetoric is already filtering through to the public, and discussions around workplace protection made it onto Nick Ferrari's morning show. Here's what one caller thought about it all.
Remove all minimum wage legislation. It's absolute nonsense that the government is involved in this. The wage set should be purely what a business can afford or want to pay in an irrational marketplace. That is how it would be. And if the government really wanted to help workers of all ages, especially young workers, they'd stop all immigration.
Nick,
simple.
Nick, some would say, what the Dickens are you talking about? Because we'll just have Scrooge bosses paying people pennies.
No, we wouldn't, because they wouldn't be able to get workers to come and work. It's a free marketplace, and if they don't like the wages and they don't like the work, don't take the job. There is absolutely no reason why employment shouldn't be arbitrated between an employee, and employer.
All right, so a boss decides to sack a woman because she's got pregnant. What are you going to do then?
Oh, I would allow it to happen.
What? Have you not had enough sleep?
Tasty boots there from that caller into Nick Ferrari's show. But I think the thing that, outside of the firing somebody for getting pregnant, which crazy to me, but then again, that's just how libertarians think. The idea that there's no reason why the government should be getting involved, or why it shouldn't just be a negotiation on a one-to-one basis between the employer and the employee, maybe because it leads to negative externalities, like people having to work far more hours than they usually would be able to do so to have a fulfilling life, to be able to make ends meet. That's the whole point of a living wage. Insofar as I'm concerned, If you want to start a business and you cannot afford to pay somebody enough for them to live, to do the work at a normal weekly hours, then you don't deserve to be in business, in my opinion. I'm sorry, that's just the case of it. If people do jobs to be able to afford to live, if they can't afford to live off of that job doesn't pay enough. Dalia, what's your reaction?
Well, the thing is reformism, Trumpism, this particular iteration of right-wing politics that we are seeing, they make a lot of noise about the EU and culture and trans people and immigration and all of this. But at their core, they are simply a vehicle for tearing up any part of the state that protects workers from bosses, that protects ordinary people. And I deliberately don't use the term anti-state because they're not anti-state. They're anti the welfare state. They're anti the social state. They are very pro the war state, the police state, the business state. So they're very in favor of the state, for example, intervening so that a business can exploit its workers, or they are very pro a state that creates the conditions for businesses or corporations to exploit our labor, land, resources, etc. But ever since the post-war consensus, and ever since this idea of a social state or a welfare state or a state that can curb the excesses, the most extreme excesses of capitalism and protect ordinary people, ever since that idea was born, with all of its flaws and all of its limitations and all of the ways in which it's been contradictory and limited and whatever, but ever since it was born, there has been a very organized faction of the elite who have done everything in their power to try and destroy it. They were against the NHS when the NHS was first emerged, and they have continued to be against everything that the welfare or social state represents. And the decimation of that begins with Thatcherism, but it continues on, and it is now in this accelerated form of Trumpism and reformism. It's sort of neoliberalism unchained, if you will. Enoch Powell, for example, we remember him a lot for his racist Rivers of Blood speech. But the other side of that coin was the fact that he was one of the most important early vocal supporters of the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is the most rampant anti-social state, neoliberal think tank in this country, the one that was behind Liz Truss's disastrous budget. So this kind of anti-woke or anti-EDI or anti-DEI politics, the politics that Doge went in and slashed up the social security in the name of, it is a Trojan horse. It is whipping up this idea that Black and brown people, that women, that trans people, that migrants, any kind of socially or culturally minoritized person has taken more than they deserve from the state. So we're going to go in, we're going to cut this government waste. We're not going to give them anything that they don't deserve to have, or we're going to sort of under this umbrella of somehow that racialized people have been given a too good of a deal by the state. And they use that as cover to go in and tear up the protections and the infrastructure of the social state that actually protects all workers. It's it's the only concession that we have won in capitalism is things like the minimum wage and things like the weekend and parental leave, pensions. These are the very few concessions that the labor movement have managed to get under capitalism, and these people are hell-bent on tearing that up. And they use anti-DEI, anti-woke, anti-affirmative action rhetoric in order to gain consent from people to do that.
Leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, Zack Polanski, was taking calls on LBC last night with veteran journalist Iain Dale. And the first caller asked him something that will give those of us who remember the 2017 election déjà vu.
I'd like to ask about the nuclear disarmament that the Green Party is planning on, or at least hoping to do in the future if you get into power. Based on what happened, obviously, with Ukraine following their disarmament in 1996, obviously, Russia didn't stick to that agreement with the Budapest Memorandum. The US hasn't really protected Ukraine, and the UK is trying its best, but doesn't have the resources to protect Ukraine. How would we be safer if we disarmed nuclear-wise? Because even if Putin were out of the picture, I think we've still got threats from China, we've still got threats from North Korea, we've got threats from just countries with bigger armies, even without nuclear weapons, that we can't defend ourselves against. I do appreciate that we are in a bit of a bind at the moment because our nuclear weapons are dependent on maintenance from America, and perhaps that's something that should be looked at. But I think at the moment, and really going forward, I don't see how we can disarm.
Thank you, Anna. So, as Anna says, we do rely on the United States for our maintenance. And in fact, I think it was Tony Blair who said that, let's be real, we could never use a nuclear weapon without the United States in terms of relationship with them. And
the military chiefs say the direct opposite.
Well, I think it has to be about what's based in fact. And we know that Trident is not independent in any meaningful sense. Now, I think the bigger question here is we signed up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we have a commitment to denuclearize, as other countries do in the world. I think it's important that people do show leadership about that, not just the UK, but actually multilateral disarmament. And I want to see countries come together and say it's been, we've just had the anniversary of Hiroshima. We know that anyone who used a nuclear weapon would be committing millions of people to absolute apocalypse, to absolute devastation. And it's clearly not acceptable to do this. And I think that can sometimes get presented as a contentious position, but for me, it's the only sane position.
Seems like a perfectly reasonable position to me. It's been an argument made by those of us on the left for quite some time, although the LBC viewers didn't seem to agree.
We've got a text question here from Jeffrey on this subject. What magical methods of persuasion would you possess to change Vladimir Putin's mind on nuclear weapons?
Yeah, so this is about diplomacy and democracy. And I know that Reform in the past have mocked me for saying that I would want to make sure that we were working with world leaders to denuclearize, the conversation we're just having. And I was asked, would that include Vladimir Putin? And the obvious thing is, how absurd a position would it be to say, I want everyone to denuclearize, but, Russia can keep their nuclear weapons? It seems quite obvious to me that if you want a world without nuclear weapons, you want to get everyone round the table, round the metaphorical table to do that.
Again, not exactly controversial stuff here from Zack around the reality of international diplomacy and negotiation. But Iain Dale was looking for some clarification from Zack around what such a negotiation might look like, and did something I have literally never seen a serious journalist do before in my life.
Well, let's imagine how that goes. Are you suggesting, therefore, that you would want to sit down as British Prime Minister with Vladimir Putin and negotiate away our nuclear weapons?
I think it's highly unlikely, but how incredible would it be if that happened? Now, we have had other times...
Well, let's imagine how that would happen. Let's do a bit of role play. I'll play Vladimir Putin.
Odd.
You play yourself. So you sit down. We haven't got a long table, unfortunately, in the studio, but you're at one end. I, Vladimir Putin, at the other end. So, Mr. Polanski, what do you want from me?
Well, I think I could point to times where the ANC and Nelson Mandela or Ireland and the Troubles, where there's been huge conflict, and we have managed to negotiate and use diplomacy to get through this.
No, but what do you say to him?
Well, what I want to do is have a negotiation to find out what exactly it is that he wants, what we can negotiate, and how we can move towards a world without nuclear weapons. Now, this wouldn't just be the two of us. We need to make sure that there's other world leaders here. And it's almost like you're recreating the United Nations if it's doing what it's meant to do.
So how do I, as Vladimir Putin, benefit from this? Why should I give away any of my nuclear weapons? Because we could obliterate you.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? That any kind of time that anyone can obliterate someone, the other person can obliterate the other person too. And if you really want to protect your population, the best thing we could do is all denuclearize. So I think it's about having a conversation. We know from game theory, for instance, that this kind of role-playing doesn't work. What ends up happening is everyone has mutual assured destruction and everyone's dead.
Mr. Polanski, I would not like to give up my nuclear weapons. What are we doing? What's happening? We have Iain Dale doing a Vladimir Putin impression and going, let's role play. You having a discussion with Vladimir Putin in the middle of an interview. I just couldn't believe when I was watching this. This isn't how international negotiation works out. You have whole teams of negotiators. You have dignitaries from each side. There's a whole diplomatic process. It's not just two world leaders go, would you like to give rid of your nuclear weapons? Can you give yourself an offer on that one? Actually, I would not like to give an offer on that. I'm out. This is now Dragon's Den. What's going on? What is going on? Iain's supposed to be a serious journalist on one of the biggest kind of talk radio stations in the country. And again, he's putting on a Russian accent, pretending to be Vladimir Putin. Now, this silliness shouldn't be a surprise, but in reality, it's just another round of the same lack of seriousness with which they characterise the mainstream media's Corbyn derangement syndrome from 2015 to 2019, of which LBC were one of the biggest culprits, with headlines such as this. Jeremy Corbyn says PM should come clean over family finances after Panama leak. Should Corbyn resign over this call? Or who could possibly forget this one? Jeremy Corbyn champions universal benefits with free school meals policy. Is just the nasty face of Corbyn's Labour. Now, that's just a small sample of the crazy press lines against him. We also had the press getting out their protractors to measure his bow at the cenotaph, or accusing him of having a Chairman Mao-style bicycle, or having a go at him for his coat, or his garden, or for being known as the absolute boy. Zack has already had his share of smears thrown his way too, and he'll have to be prepared for the media to keep doing so, as the Greens are now a credible threat to the Uniparty. In the latest YouGov poll, the Greens are the highest polling party for the entire under-65 cohort. That's all working-age people, by the way. And with the by-election next week in Gorton and Denton and the local elections in May, we'll see whether that can translate into electoral success. The reality is that the mainstream media will use every opportunity to treat the left as unserious. So the left has to treat the mainstream media with disdain in response. We have our own channels of communication, and we don't need to entertain people like Iain Dale turning political discussion into childish parlour games. Dalia, that was not something I'd ever seen any journalists do. Have you seen that kind of thing before?
Well, it's funny. It shows you how traumatized I am by the British media, that when I first saw that there was going to be an hour-long sit-down between Zack Polanski and Iain Dale, I thought, oh, good, finally, they're giving a proper platform to Zack Polanski. I'm so used to them disregarding left-wing voices that I was almost pleasantly surprised. And then as I was listening to the show, in one of the ad breaks, whose voice do I hear but the voice of Nigel Farage advertising his show on LBC? And it made me remember that whilst I'm thinking, oh, how unusual and how pleasantly surprising it is that Zack Polanski had a whole hour-long sit-down with LBC, whilst Nigel Farage, since 2017, with just a sort of brief break in the middle of it, since 2017 has had a 5-day-a-week show on LBC in which he's the host, meaning he is setting the entire terms of the conversation. And so we have one person, Zack Polanski, or, the Green Party, one political force in this country that exists outside of the centre, gets every so often a 1-hour segment, and the other one has a 5-day-a-week show on one of the biggest, I think the biggest radio station in the country. And, as I always say, if the Greens represent the left of centre in this country, and Nigel Farage and his various political vehicles represent the right of centre, only one of those parties that exist outside of the centre has, up until the last election, actually had a consistent democratic mandate from the British people, have actually been elected and re-elected to Westminster, and that is the Green Party. And yet, despite that, elite and establishment media in this country, whether it's LBC, whether it's the BBC, this cuts across both public and private broadcasting. Only one of those, the party or the various political vehicles of Nigel Farage, despite until recently never having a mandate in British politics, a democratic mandate in British politics, the media has been hell-bent in cultivating Nigel Farage and the various parties he's run and these different right-wing outriders. I mean, Katie Hopkins at some point had a show on LBC. They have been aggressively cultivated as the only alternative, legitimate political force, despite the fact that the British people hadn't actually organically been voting for him and had actually been voting for a different alternative, which is the Green Party. They have been rammed down our throats as the only alternative, legitimate political actor. And that's because, as in the eyes of the establishment and the elite, if the political centre is going to collapse, which I think they are always prepared for it to collapse, any establishment or elite worth its salt has a game plan for what happens if there's a popular revolt or a popular dissent against the centre. They want to make sure that if the centre is going to collapse, the pieces will be picked up by the far right rather than by the left, because as we have discussed throughout this show, Helena, when it comes to them wanting to scrap minimum wage, them wanting to scrap employer protections, their policy program fundamentally aligns with the interests of big business and capital and conserving existing power structures. And so for me, I just thought, not only when we look at the way that Iain Dale sort of deliberately tries to discredit the entire concept of interviewing Zack Polanski as a serious political candidate, which he does so by turning it into a kind of pantomime, it also goes far beyond that and far more historically, when you consider the fact that the LBC has given Nigel Farage an unmediated, unabashed platform 5 days of a week, 1 hour every day, where he has gotten to set the terms of the conversation. And that has been going on for the past 9 years now. And so that is actually why we're in the situation that we're in. The rise of reform wasn't inevitable. The rise of reform was engineered.
Thank you very much, Dalia, for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me, Helena.
It's always a pleasure to enjoy Ladies' Night. And again, at least we've got a good news day today, at least, to be able to have us together on. And as always, thank you everyone at home for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.